Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the dusty, papyrus-scented world of ancient Egypt, but not the glamorous tomb-raiding, pyramid-building version you see in movies. No, we're talking about the daily grind of Amenhotep the Scribe, whose biggest thrill was correctly spelling hieroglyphs, and whose worst nightmare was running out of read ink on a busy Tuesday. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy watching paint dry at historically accurate speeds. Let me know in the comments what time it is where you are. I'm always fascinated to see who's joining us from around the world to learn about ancient bureaucracy at 2 AM. Now dim the lights, maybe grab a glass of water, not wine. We're not pharaohs here, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight, we're following a man whose life was so thoroughly documented that we know more about his daily bowel movements than most people know about their own great-grandparents. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why that level of detail was both a blessing and a curse. Picture this, it's approximately 1350 BCE, and the sun is already scorching the mud brick buildings of Thebes by the time our hero, Amenhotep, rolls off his reed mat. He's not rolling toward glory, conquest, or divine revelation. He's rolling toward another day of copying religious texts, calculating grain taxes, and trying not to let his hand cramp while recording the pharaoh's daily pronouncements about how incredibly divine he is. Amenhotep is what the Egyptians called a sesh, a scribe, and in a civilization where literacy was rarer than honest politicians, that made him simultaneously invaluable and utterly replaceable. But here's the thing about ancient Egyptian scribes. They weren't just glorified secretaries. They were the backbone of an empire that lasted longer than Christianity has existed. They recorded everything, and I mean everything. Births, deaths, taxes, military campaigns, religious ceremonies, royal bowel movements, the number of onions consumed by pyramid workers, and the exact measurements of every cat mummy in the royal burial chamber. If it happened in ancient Egypt, a scribe wrote it down, probably in triplicate with accompanying diagrams. Amenhotep himself was what we might call middle management in the grand bureaucracy of eternity. Not important enough to have his own tomb covered in gold, but skilled enough that his death would cause at least 3 days of administrative chaos before someone could replace him. He'd been trained since childhood in the house of scribes, learning to read and write hieroglyphs, hieratic script, and basic mathematics. His parents, probably farmers or craftsmen, had sold everything they owned to get him this education, betting their entire family's future on the hope that their son could write his way out of peasantry. And it worked, sort of. By age 35, Amenhotep had risen to the position of scribe of the sacred recordings in the temple of Amun-Ra, which sounds impressive until you realize it meant he spent most of his time copying the same religious texts over and over again, each copy requiring perfect accuracy lest he face punishment ranging from reduced rations to having his writing hand chopped off. Egyptian bureaucracy didn't mess around with quality control. Our scribe lived in a modest house in the scribes' quarter of Thebes, a neighborhood that was basically ancient Egypt's equivalent of a middle-class suburb, except the streets were unpaved. The sewage system consisted of throw it in the Nile and hope for the best, and your neighbors included people who could literally curse you to death if you borrowed their grinding stone without asking. His house was made of mud brick, whitewashed to reflect the brutal sun, with small windows positioned to catch whatever breeze the gods deigned to send. It contained a main room for living and working, a smaller room for sleeping, a courtyard for cooking and keeping his goose. Yes, every self-respecting Egyptian scribe had a goose, partly for eggs, and partly because geese were considered sacred to Thoth, the god of writing. The goose, whose name was probably something like Honker of Truth or Sacred Waddle, served as both breakfast provider and religious insurance policy. Scribes took their relationship with Thoth very seriously, because in a world where your livelihood depended on your ability to write clearly, Having the god of wisdom on your side was more valuable than health insurance. Amenhotep's day began before dawn. Not by choice, but because his neighbor was a priest who insisted on conducting his morning prayers at a volume that suggested he believed the gods were not only deaf, but possibly located on the moon. The priest's devotions involved chanting, bell ringing, and what sounded like rhythmic beating of small animals, though it was probably just percussion instruments. Probably. After rolling off his sleeping mat and muttering what were undoubtedly ancient Egyptian equivalents of modern profanity, Amenhotep would begin his morning routine. First, he'd check on his goose, which had probably spent the night terrorizing any mice brave enough to venture into the courtyard. Then he'd wash his face and hands in a basin of water that had been sitting out all night, collecting dust and probably a few insects that mistook it for a tiny oasis. Breakfast was simple. Bread, maybe some cheese if he'd been paid recently, and beer. Yes, beer for breakfast. But before you get excited, ancient Egyptian beer was more like liquid bread with a barely detectable alcohol content. It was safer than water, more nutritious than wine, and had the added benefit of making the morning's copying of Hymn to Ra's glorious toenails seem slightly less tedious. The bread was usually a day or two old, hard enough to require dunking in the beer to make it chewable. Ancient Egyptian bread was notoriously gritty, filled with sand and stone particles from the grinding process. Most Egyptians spent their entire adult lives slowly wearing down their teeth on bread that was roughly equivalent to eating sandpaper soaked in grain mash. Archaeological evidence shows that even wealthy Egyptians had teeth worn down to the gums by middle age. And Amenhotep's daily breakfast was contributing to this slow-motion dental apocalypse with every bite. After breakfast, he would gather his tools of the trade, reed pens, ink cakes made from soot, water, and tree gum, papyrus sheets, and a small wooden pallet with depressions for mixing ink. These tools were probably worth more than everything else he owned combined. Papyrus was expensive, imported from the Nile Delta marshes. Reed pens had to be cut and shaped just right, too soft, and they'd disintegrate too hard and they'd tear the papyrus. The ink had to be mixed fresh daily to the proper consistency. Too thick and it would blob, too thin and it would run. A scribe's entire career could be ruined by consistently poor ink consistency. He'd also carry a small bag of sand for blotting wet ink, a knife for cutting papyrus and sharpening pens, and a small jar of water for mixing ink and cleaning his tools. The entire kit had to be carried carefully, because dropping and breaking any component could mean weeks of reduced income while he saved up for replacements. The walk to the temple complex where he worked took about 20 minutes through the streets of Thebes, which in the early morning were already bustling with activity. Bakers were pulling fresh bread from ovens, filling the air with the smell of baking grain and wood smoke. Fishermen were returning from their pre-dawn expeditions on the Nile, their boats loaded with fish that would be sold, salted or dried before the heat of the day made them inedible. Farmers were driving donkeys loaded with vegetables toward the market squares, their animals adding to the symphony of braying, shouting, and general chaos that passed for rush hour in ancient Egypt. The streets themselves were narrow, unpaved paths between mud brick buildings, with no real sanitation system beyond occasional drainage ditches that carried away rainwater during the brief flood season. The rest of the year, they mostly carried away whatever people threw into them, which was everything. Garbage, human waste, animal waste, broken pottery, food scraps. It all went into the streets, where it was trampled into a kind of organic pavement that probably glowed in the dark from all the bacterial activity. Dogs roamed the streets in packs, living off scraps and garbage, occasionally supplemented by unwary rats or the contents of someone's chamber pot. Cats were everywhere too, revered as sacred animals and generally well treated, which meant they were fat, lazy, and utterly indifferent to the rodent problem that plagued every Egyptian household. The cats had evolved beyond mere pest control. They were living gods who occasionally deigned to notice a mouse, usually to play with it rather than kill it efficiently. As Amenhotep walked to work, he'd pass vendors setting up their stalls, selling everything from bread and beer to amulets guaranteed to protect against everything from crocodiles to ingrown toenails. The amulet vendors were particularly aggressive, since everyone in ancient Egypt lived in constant fear of being cursed, poisoned, eaten by hippos, or struck down by angry gods. A good protection amulet was like insurance, and the vendors made sure everyone knew that walking around without proper magical protection was basically suicide. The temple complex of Amun-Ra was one of the largest in Thebes, covering several acres with multiple buildings, courtyards, gardens, and enough priests to staff a small army. The main temple building was massive, with columns thick enough to hide behind during the frequent religious processions that swept through the complex like theological hurricanes. The walls were covered in hieroglyphic inscriptions recording the great deeds of various pharaohs, most of which had been greatly exaggerated or completely fabricated by scribes, who understood that truth was less important than job security. Amenhotep's office, if you could call it that, was a small chamber in one of the administrative buildings, with a window that faced east to catch the morning light. The room contained a low table, several storage jars for papyrus and supplies, and a small shrine to Thoth, where he would make daily offerings of bread and beer. The shrine was essential, not just for religious reasons, but because scribes genuinely believed that Thoth could cause their hands to cramp or their minds to go blank if they failed to show proper respect. The walls of his workspace were covered with reference materials, lists of hieroglyphic symbols and their meanings, standard phrases for different types of documents, mathematical tables for calculating taxes and measurements, and religious formulae that had to be copied exactly or risk invoking divine wrath. Some of these reference materials had been copied so many times that they were worn nearly transparent, the papyrus fibers visible through layers of faded ink. His daily work routine rarely varied. First, he would review any documents that needed to be copied or completed from the previous day. Then he would receive new assignments from his supervisor, a priest scribe named Kaimwaset, who had achieved his position through a combination of genuine skill and strategic brown-nosing that would have impressed modern corporate middle management. The assignments varied, but they generally fell into several categories: religious texts that needed to be copied for temple archives, administrative records for tax collection and resource management, correspondence between temple officials and government bureaucrats, and what we might call propaganda documents that recorded the pharaoh's divine accomplishments in terms so glowing that they bordered on fantasy fiction. Copying religious texts was the most nerve-wracking work, because accuracy was not just expected, but magically enforced. According to Egyptian belief, religious texts contained actual divine power, and copying them incorrectly could literally unleash curses upon the scribe, his family, his descendants, and possibly his goose. Every word, every symbol, every spacing had to be perfect. Some religious texts included warnings that incorrect copying would result in the scribe's heart being devoured by demons in the afterlife, which was the kind of workplace safety regulation that really focused the mind. The process of copying was methodical and exhausting. First, Amenhotep would read through the entire original document to understand its content and identify any particularly tricky passages. Then he would prepare his materials, cutting papyrus to the right size, mixing ink to the proper consistency, and sharpening his reed pens to the exact point needed for clean, precise lines. The actual copying was done one line at a time, with frequent breaks to rest his hand and prevent cramping. A single mistake could ruin an entire sheet of expensive papyrus, so speed was always sacrificed for accuracy. He would typically copy for about 2 hours, then take a break to rest his eyes and hand, then copy for another 2 hours. A skilled scribe could produce about 10 to 15 lines of text per hour, depending on the complexity of the hieroglyphs involved. The hieroglyphic writing system was monumentally complex, with over 700 different symbols that could represent sounds, words, or concepts depending on context. Some symbols looked nearly identical, but had completely different meanings. Others changed meaning based on their position relative to other symbols. It was like writing in a language where the difference between "I love you" and "I will sacrifice you to crocodiles" might be a single misplaced line in one character. And then there was hieratic script, the cursive version of hieroglyphs used for everyday writing. Hieratic was faster to write but harder to read, especially when copied by scribes with less than perfect penmanship. Amenhotep had to be fluent in both scripts, able to translate between them, and capable of reading documents written by other scribes whose handwriting might charitably be described as artistic. By midday, when the sun had turned his small office into what felt like the inside of a bread oven, Amenhotep would break for lunch. The temple provided simple meals for its workers: bread, beer, onions, and occasionally dried fish or meat. The meal was eaten in the courtyard with other scribes and temple workers, providing one of the few opportunities for social interaction during the workday. These lunch conversations were carefully modulated, because everyone understood that criticism of superiors, complaints about working conditions, or skeptical comments about religious doctrine could result in punishment ranging from reduced rations to reassignment to a position involving the cleaning of sacred crocodiles. Yes, that was a real job, and no, it did not come with hazard pay. Instead, the conversation focused on safe topics: the weather, always hot; the Nile flood levels, crucial for next year's harvest; local gossip that didn't involve anyone important enough to matter; and technical discussions about ink consistency and papyrus quality. Occasionally, someone would share news from other parts of Egypt, usually involving military campaigns, trade missions, or the construction of yet another massive monument to some pharaoh's ego. The afternoon work session was often the most challenging, because the heat made concentration difficult and hand cramps more frequent. The small office windows provided minimal ventilation, and the combination of physical discomfort and mental fatigue made mistakes more likely. This was when Amenhotep's years of training really mattered, because copying text correctly while sweating profusely and fighting off heat-induced drowsiness required a level of discipline that bordered on meditation. During particularly hot afternoons, some scribes would work by oil lamp in windowless interior rooms that stayed cooler, but this created other problems. Oil lamps produced smoke that irritated the eyes and lungs, and the flickering light made it harder to distinguish between similar-looking hieroglyphs. Plus, working by artificial light was considered slightly disrespectful to Ra, the sun god, who might interpret it as a rejection of his divine illumination. As the afternoon wore on, Amenhotep would often find himself copying the same types of documents over and over again. Administrative records, for instance, followed rigid formulas. In the number year of the reign of Pharaoh's full titles, which usually took up half a line, in the season, official's name and title, reports that, whatever needed to be reported, witnessed by list of witnesses, recorded by scribe's name, in the presence of various gods, who were apparently very interested in bureaucratic accuracy. These formulaic documents might seem boring, but they were actually the lifeblood of Egyptian civilization. Every grain of wheat, every head of cattle, every jar of beer, every piece of jewelry, every tool, every building material, it all had to be counted, recorded, and tracked through a bureaucratic system so complex it would make modern tax codes look like children's picture books. The Egyptian tax system, for instance, required scribes to track not just how much grain each farmer produced, but how much land they farmed, what the flood levels were in their area, what tools they used, how many workers they employed, what their family situation was, and probably what their favorite breakfast cereal was. All of this information had to be cross-referenced with records from previous years to detect fraud, calculate proper tax rates, and ensure that everyone was contributing their fair share to the pharaoh's various building projects. Military records were even more complex. Scribes had to track troop movements, supply requirements, casualty reports, equipment inventories, and detailed battle reports that often bore little resemblance to reality. Egyptian pharaohs had a tendency to transform minor skirmishes into epic victories and tactical retreats into strategic withdrawals, which meant that military scribes spent a lot of time finding creative ways to describe defeats without actually using the word defeat. Religious records were perhaps the most important of all, because they dealt with matters of cosmic significance. Every religious ceremony, every offering, every prayer, every oracle consultation had to be recorded in precise detail. The gods were apparently very concerned with accurate record keeping, and failure to properly document religious activities could result in divine punishment affecting not just individuals, but entire communities. As the workday neared its end, usually around late afternoon, when the heat finally began to subside, Amenhotep would clean his tools and organize his workspace for the next day. This involved carefully washing his reed pens and palette, sealing his ink cakes to prevent them from drying out, and storing his papyrus in sealed jars to protect it from moisture, insects, and mice. The walk home took him through streets that were now busy with evening activities. Markets were still open, with vendors calling out the prices of whatever they were selling in voices that could probably be heard from space. Children were playing in the streets, their games involving sticks, balls, and what appeared to be early versions of tag and hide and seek. Women were drawing water from wells and public cisterns, balancing heavy jars on their heads with a grace that spoke of lifelong practice. The evening air was filled with the smells of cooking food, bread baking for the next day, fish and meat grilling over small fires, vegetables stewing in clay pots. These smells mixed with less pleasant aromas from the various human and animal activities that took place in the streets, creating an olfactory experience that was distinctly ancient Egyptian, a combination of domestic comfort and urban reality that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone who lived in the ancient world. Back at his house, Amenhotep would tend to his goose, which had probably spent the day terrorizing insects and small reptiles in the courtyard. The goose served as both breakfast provider and early warning system, since geese are notoriously aggressive and would attack any intruder with the fury of a feathered demon. In a neighborhood where theft was common and law enforcement consisted mainly of catch the thief yourself and beat him with sticks, having a protective goose was actually pretty valuable home security. Dinner was usually similar to breakfast: bread, beer, maybe some cheese or dried fish if his budget allowed. Fresh meat was a luxury reserved for religious festivals and special occasions, partly because of cost and partly because of preservation problems. In a climate where fresh meat could spoil in a matter of hours, most protein came from dried, salted or pickled sources that could survive the heat. The evening was one of the few times when Amenhotep could relax and pursue personal interests. Some scribes used this time to practice their writing skills, copying religious texts for their own spiritual benefit, or creating personal documents like letters to family members in other cities. Others engaged in games like Senet, a board game that was apparently so popular in ancient Egypt that even the gods played it in the afterlife. But mostly, the evening was a time for maintenance activities that kept daily life functioning. Clothes had to be washed and mended, tools had to be maintained, household repairs had to be done, and social obligations had to be met. Ancient Egyptian society was held together by a complex web of reciprocal relationships. You helped your neighbors with their problems, they helped you with yours, and everyone hoped that the system would hold together long enough for everyone to die of natural causes rather than social collapse. As darkness fell, oil lamps were lit throughout the house, casting flickering shadows on the whitewashed walls. These lamps burned a mixture of animal fat and oil that produced a steady but smoky flame, providing enough light for basic activities but not enough for detailed work like writing. The combination of lamplight and shadows created an atmosphere that was simultaneously cozy and slightly eerie, with the ever-present awareness that the darkness outside contained all manner of potential threats. Night in ancient Egypt was when the dangerous creatures came out. Hippos emerging from the Nile to graze on crops and attack anyone unfortunate enough to be in their path. Crocodiles cruising the shallows looking for unwary water draws, and various snakes and scorpions seeking cool places to hide during the day's heat. But beyond the natural dangers, night was also when supernatural threats were most active: demons, ghosts, malevolent spirits, and gods in their more wrathful aspects. This meant that going to bed involved a series of protective rituals, prayers to various gods, the arrangement of protective amulets around the sleeping area, and the recitation of spells designed to ward off nightmares and nocturnal visitations. Some Egyptians slept with their doors barricaded, not just against human thieves, but against supernatural intruders who might steal their breath, their names, or their souls. Amenhotep's sleeping area was a small room, with a window positioned to catch the night breeze, though it was usually covered with the cloth to keep out insects and unwanted spirits. His bed was a simple frame with rope supports and a thin mattress stuffed with straw or reeds. Pillows were hard headrests made of wood or stone, designed more for proper alignment than comfort. Wealthy Egyptians might have pillows stuffed with feathers or soft cloth, but scribes generally made do with whatever was cheap and functional. Sleep itself was considered a vulnerable state, when the soul left the body to travel in dream realms that might be populated by gods, demons, or the spirits of the dead. Dreams were taken very seriously in ancient Egypt, considered to be messages from the gods or glimpses of future events. Bad dreams required immediate consultation with priests who specialized in dream interpretation, along with purification rituals and protective spells. Good dreams, on the other hand, were seen as divine favor and often influenced major life decisions. A dream about a particular god might inspire someone to make offerings at that god's temple. A dream about a deceased relative might indicate that the family tomb needed maintenance, or that certain religious obligations had been neglected. Dreams about the pharaoh were considered especially significant and had to be reported to authorities, because they might contain important information about the kingdom's future. This daily routine: wake up, eat gritty bread, walk to work through streets filled with garbage and animals, spend 8 hours copying documents in unbearable heat, walk home, eat more bread, perform protective rituals, and sleep fitfully while worrying about supernatural attacks was Amenhotep's life for years, decades even. It was a life of routines so rigid and repetitive that modern people would probably consider it a form of psychological torture. And yet, by the standards of ancient Egypt, Amenhotep was living well. He had regular work, steady income, social status, and the respect that came with literacy in a world where most people couldn't write their own names. He owned property, however modest. He had enough food to avoid starvation and enough security to plan for the future. In a world where the average person's biggest aspiration was to die of old age rather than violence, disease, or starvation, Amenhotep's boring, repetitive, physically uncomfortable life represented a kind of success. But here is where the story takes a turn toward the absurd, because even this modest success story was built on a foundation that was slowly crumbling beneath his feet. The Egyptian Empire, for all its impressive monuments and complex bureaucracy, was beginning to show signs of the rot that would eventually bring down the entire civilization. The pharaoh, during Amenhotep's time, was Akhenaten, a ruler who decided that Egypt's traditional pantheon of hundreds of gods was too complicated and should be replaced with worship of a single deity, the sun disk, Aten. This might sound like a reasonable theological simplification, except that it meant dismissing thousands of priests, closing temples, destroying religious art, and basically upending the entire religious and economic system that had kept Egypt stable for over 1,000 years. Akhenaten's religious revolution created chaos throughout the bureaucratic system that employed scribes like Amenhotep. Religious texts that had been copied for centuries were suddenly declared heretical. Temples that had employed hundreds of scribes were closed overnight. Administrative procedures that had been refined over generations were thrown out in favor of new systems that nobody really understood. The ripple effects were immediate and devastating. Tax collection became erratic because local officials didn't know which religious authorities were still legitimate. Trade relationships with other countries deteriorated because Egyptian diplomatic correspondence was now filled with confusing references to a god that nobody outside Egypt had ever heard of. Military morale plummeted because soldiers didn't know which gods they were supposed to pray to for protection in battle. For scribes, the chaos was particularly acute because their work depended on continuity and standardization. When the religious and legal frameworks changed overnight, thousands of documents became obsolete or legally questionable. Contracts written under the old system might no longer be valid. Religious texts that scribes had spent years copying were now considered dangerous to possess. Administrative procedures that had been memorized through years of repetition were suddenly wrong. Amenhotep found himself in the position of having to learn entirely new sets of documents, procedures, and even vocabulary. The old religious formulae that had been second nature to him were now forbidden. New formulae praising Aten had to be memorized and copied with the same precision that had been applied to the old texts, except that there were no established standards for these new documents because they were being written for the first time. The stress of this transition began to take its toll on scribes throughout Egypt. Some suffered nervous breakdowns from the constant fear of making mistakes in the new system. Others developed physical ailments, hand cramps that became permanent, eye problems from straining to read unfamiliar texts, and digestive issues from the stress of never knowing whether today's work would be declared heretical tomorrow. Amenhotep himself began to experience symptoms that would be familiar to anyone who has worked in a dysfunctional organization during a period of rapid, poorly planned change. He developed chronic headaches, probably from the stress of trying to do familiar work under completely unfamiliar rules. His handwriting, which had been steady and precise for years, became shaky and inconsistent. He began making copying errors, something that had been extremely rare in his previous work. The errors were small at first, a misplaced line in a hieroglyph here, a spacing irregularity there. But in the perfectionist world of Egyptian bureaucracy, small errors were like cracks in a dam. Once they started appearing, they tended to multiply and spread. A scribe who made errors lost the confidence of his supervisors, which led to closer scrutiny of his work, which increased stress and led to more errors. The psychological pressure was immense. In the old system, scribes had worked within established traditions that provided clear guidelines for every aspect of their job. They knew exactly how to format documents, which formulae to use, which gods to invoke, and what constituted acceptable work. The new system was being improvised on a daily basis, with rules changing so frequently that what was correct in the morning might be wrong by afternoon. Worse, the political implications of mistakes had become much more serious. Under the old system, a copying error in a religious text might result in ritual purification or extra offerings to appease offended gods. Under Akhenaten's regime, the same error might be interpreted as deliberate sabotage or hidden loyalty to the forbidden gods, accusations that could result in imprisonment, exile, or death. This atmosphere of paranoia and uncertainty permeated every aspect of scribal work. Colleagues who had worked together for years began viewing each other with suspicion, wondering who might report them for using old formulae or making comments that could be interpreted as criticism of the new order. The casual conversations that had made lunch breaks bearable became stilted and careful, with everyone aware that a careless word might be overheard and misinterpreted. The quality of work throughout the bureaucratic system began to deteriorate. Documents that should have been processed quickly sat in administrative limbo, while officials tried to figure out which procedures were still valid. Communication between different government departments became confused, and contradictory. Tax collection, always a complex process, became increasingly erratic as local officials struggled to implement new policies that often contradicted each other. Amenhotep watched his carefully ordered world dissolve into chaos, and like many people caught in the middle of systemic collapse, he tried to maintain normalcy through rigid adherence to routine. He continued to wake up at the same time, eat the same breakfast, walk the same route to work, and approach his duties with the same methodical precision that had characterized his entire career. But the routine was increasingly hollow, because the context that had given it meaning was disappearing. Copying religious texts accurately had mattered when those texts were considered sacred and eternal. Now they were just words on papyrus, subject to political revision and potentially dangerous to possess. Administrative precision had been important when the administrative system was stable and predictable. Now it was an exercise in frustration, trying to be accurate within a system that changed faster than accuracy could be achieved. The physical toll of working under these conditions began to manifest in ways that will be familiar to anyone who has experienced chronic workplace stress. Amenhotep's sleep became fitful and unreliable, filled with anxiety dreams about making copying errors or being accused of disloyalty. His appetite decreased, partly from stress and partly because the disruption of normal trade relationships had made food more expensive and less available. His hands, which had been his primary professional tools for decades, began to develop problems that went beyond normal occupational wear. The constant stress caused muscle tension that made precise movements more difficult. The anxiety about making mistakes led to overthinking every pen stroke, which paradoxically made errors more likely. What had once been automatic natural movements became self-conscious and clumsy. More seriously, his eyes began to suffer from the strain of trying to work under deteriorating conditions. The temple's resources were being diverted to Akhenaten's new capital city, which meant less money for maintaining workspaces. Windows that needed repair went unfixed, leaving scribes to work in poor light that strained their vision. Oil for lamps became more expensive and lower quality, producing smokier flames that irritated the eyes and lungs. The papyrus quality also deteriorated as supply chains were disrupted and quality control broke down. Sheets that should have provided smooth, consistent writing surfaces instead had rough spots, thin areas, and irregular textures that made clean copying nearly impossible. Reed pens that should have lasted for weeks wore out in days when used on inferior papyrus. Ink that should have produced crisp, dark lines instead appeared blotchy and uneven. These material problems compounded the psychological stress, creating a feedback loop of frustration and declining performance. Poor tools made good work harder to achieve, which increased anxiety about making mistakes, which led to greater tension and clumsiness, which made the poor tools even more difficult to use effectively. As months passed, Amenhotep began to develop what we might now recognize as signs of depression and anxiety disorder. He found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on his work, often reading the same passage multiple times without comprehending its meaning. Simple decisions became overwhelming: which reed pen to use, how much ink to mix, whether a particular hieroglyph looked correct. Tasks that had once taken minutes now consumed hours. His social interactions became strained as well. The lunch conversations with colleagues, already constrained by political fears, became increasingly difficult for him to navigate. He found himself either sitting in silence or making comments that seemed to hang in the air awkwardly, revealing his growing detachment from the social fabric of the workplace. At home, his relationship with his goose began to change. The bird, which had always been a source of practical benefit and modest companionship, became an additional source of anxiety. Feeding it properly required resources that were becoming more expensive and harder to obtain. The eggs it provided were increasingly important to his diet as other food sources became less reliable, which made him worry constantly about the bird's health and productivity. Even the goose seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. Animals are often sensitive to human stress, and the bird's behavior became more agitated and unpredictable. It would honk loudly at inappropriate times, attack visitors more aggressively, and generally contribute to the growing chaos of Amenhotep's daily life, rather than providing the stability it had once represented. The breaking point came during the copying of a particularly important religious text, one of the new hymns to Aten that was supposed to be distributed to temples throughout Egypt. Amenhotep had been working on the document for several days, fighting fatigue and anxiety to produce his most careful work. The text was nearly complete when he made a catastrophic error. He accidentally included a reference to Amun-Ra, the old sun god who had been officially replaced by Aten. In the old system, such an error might have been corrected by carefully scraping away the incorrect text and writing over it, or by adding a marginal note explaining the correction. Under the new regime, however, mixing references to old and new gods could be interpreted as deliberate subversion, an attempt to undermine Akhenaten's religious revolution. When his supervisor discovered the error, the reaction was swift and devastating. The entire document had to be destroyed and recreated from the beginning, wasting days of work and expensive materials. Amenhotep was subjected to a formal inquiry to determine whether the error had been intentional. Even though he was eventually cleared of deliberate wrongdoing, his reputation was permanently damaged. The psychological impact of this incident was profound. For a man whose entire professional identity was built on accuracy and reliability, being accused of deliberate error was like being accused of professional treason. Even though the charges were ultimately dismissed, the fact that they had been made at all undermined his confidence in his own abilities and his place in the system he had served faithfully for decades. From that point forward, Amenhotep's work was subject to increased scrutiny and oversight. Every document he produced was checked and double-checked by supervisors, who made it clear that they considered him a potential security risk. The trust and autonomy that had made his work bearable disappeared, replaced by a suffocating atmosphere of suspicion and micromanagement. The irony was that this increased oversight actually made errors more likely, not less. When every pen stroke is being watched and judged, when every decision is subject to second-guessing, when every page is scrutinized for signs of disloyalty or incompetence, the natural flow of skilled work becomes impossible. Amenhotep found himself second-guessing every choice, overthinking every movement, and becoming increasingly paralyzed by the fear of making another mistake. His productivity plummeted. Documents that should have taken a day to complete now required 3 or 4 days of painstaking, anxious labor. The quality of his work, already compromised by stress and poor materials, deteriorated further under the pressure of constant observation. But the real tragedy wasn't just Amenhotep's personal decline. It was what his story represented about the collapse of an entire civilization's institutional knowledge. Egyptian scribes weren't just copying documents, they were preserving and transmitting the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of human civilization. When the scribal system broke down, that knowledge began to disappear. The mathematical techniques that had been used to build the pyramids were forgotten when the scribes who knew them were reassigned to copying hymns to Aten. The astronomical observations that had been carefully recorded for centuries were lost when the priests who maintained them were expelled from their temples. The agricultural knowledge that had allowed Egypt to feed itself during drought years vanished when the administrative system that preserved it was dismantled. This wasn't just bureaucratic inefficiency, it was cultural suicide. Egypt had survived invasions, famines, political upheavals, and natural disasters by maintaining its institutional memory through its scribal system. When that system was deliberately destroyed in the name of religious reform, the empire lost its ability to learn from its own history. Amenhotep lived through the early stages of this collapse, watching his profession and his entire way of life slowly disintegrate around him. The temple where he worked began to operate with a skeleton crew as resources were diverted to Akhenaten's new capital. Many of his colleagues were reassigned, dismissed, or simply left to find other work. The documents he had spent his career creating were boxed up and stored in rooms where they would slowly decay from neglect. The psychological impact of watching his life's work become irrelevant was devastating. Imagine spending decades mastering a complex skill, building a reputation for excellence, contributing to something larger than yourself, only to see it all declared obsolete overnight. The careful hierarchy of knowledge and experience that had given structure to his world was replaced by chaos and improvisation. His physical health, already compromised by stress, began to deteriorate more rapidly. The chronic headaches became more frequent and severe. His hands, damaged by years of repetitive motion and recent stress, developed a tremor that made precise writing increasingly difficult. His eyesight, strained by decades of close work under poor conditions, began to fail at exactly the moment when his career most required perfect vision. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Amenhotep's decline was how utterly predictable and preventable it was. The signs of systemic collapse had been visible for years before Akhenaten's revolution. The bureaucracy had become bloated and inefficient. Corruption was widespread. The gap between rich and poor had grown to unsustainable levels. Military expenses were consuming an ever larger share of the empire's resources. A wise reform program might have addressed these problems gradually, preserving institutional knowledge while adapting to changing circumstances. Instead, Akhenaten's radical approach destroyed the existing system without creating a viable replacement, leaving people like Amenhotep trapped in a collapsing structure with no escape route. The irony was that Amenhotep had dedicated his life to serving a system that ultimately had no loyalty to him in return. He had sacrificed his health, his family time, his personal interests, and his economic security for the sake of institutional continuity. When the institution decided to reinvent itself, his sacrifice was simply forgotten, his expertise discarded as irrelevant to the new order. As the months passed, and his situation became increasingly untenable, Amenhotep began to experience what we might now recognize as an existential crisis. The meaning that had structured his entire adult life, the sense that his work was important, that accuracy mattered, that he was contributing to something eternal and valuable, had evaporated. He was left with the routine without the purpose, the labor without the meaning. He still woke up at the same time each morning, still walked the same route to work, still sat at the same desk and performed the same basic tasks. But the context that had made these activities meaningful was gone. He was going through the motions of a life that no longer made sense, trapped by economic necessity in a job that had become a form of slow psychological torture. The stress began to manifest in increasingly visible ways. His handwriting, once a source of professional pride, became shaky and irregular. Colleagues began to notice his frequent pauses during conversations, his difficulty following complex instructions, his tendency to stare blankly at documents for long periods without apparent comprehension. These symptoms might seem minor, but in a profession where mental sharpness and manual dexterity were essential, they were career-ending. Word began to spread that Amenhotep was losing his edge, a euphemism that carried serious implications in a competitive work environment where job security depended on maintaining high-performance standards. The social isolation that resulted from his declining reputation compounded his psychological problems. Colleagues who had once included him in their lunch conversations began to exclude him, either from embarrassment about his condition or from fear that association with the declining scribe might damage their own careers. The informal networks of mutual support that help people navigate workplace challenges closed themselves to him. At home, his isolation was equally profound. His neighbors, many of whom worked in related professions, were dealing with their own versions of the same systemic problems. The entire community of scribes, priests, and administrative workers was under stress. which meant that the social support systems that might have helped individuals cope were themselves breaking down. His goose, which had once provided both practical benefits and modest companionship, became an additional burden as his resources dwindled. Feeding the bird properly required grain that was becoming more expensive and harder to obtain. The eggs it provided were still valuable, but the cost of maintaining the bird was approaching the value of its production. This might seem like a trivial problem, but for someone whose life was already stripped of meaning and purpose, even small decisions became overwhelming. Whether to keep the goose or sell it represented a choice between maintaining the last vestige of his former life and adapting to his new circumstances. Either choice felt like a betrayal of something important. The decision was ultimately made for him when the goose became ill, probably from poor quality feed or contaminated water. Veterinary care for animals was primitive in ancient Egypt, consisting mainly of religious rituals and herbal remedies that were usually ineffective. The bird suffered for several days before dying, leaving Amenhotep with one fewer source of food and one more reminder of his declining circumstances. The death of the goose might have been insignificant in the context of his broader problems, but it became symbolic of everything he was losing. The bird had represented continuity, tradition, and the modest security that came with self-sufficiency. Its death marked another step in his transformation from a self-sufficient professional to a dependent worker trapped in a failing system. As his personal situation deteriorated, the broader political situation was also becoming increasingly unstable. Akhenaten's religious revolution had weakened Egypt's international position, as traditional allies were confused and alienated by the sudden changes in Egyptian policy and practice. Military campaigns that should have been routine successes became costly failures, as Egyptian forces struggled with disrupted supply lines and confused command structures. The economic consequences were severe. Trade relationships that had provided Egypt with essential resources were damaged or severed. Tax collection became increasingly erratic as local officials struggled to implement changing policies with inadequate guidance. The construction projects that had provided employment for thousands of workers were abandoned or delayed as resources were diverted to Akhenaten's new capital. For scribes like Amenhotep, these macroeconomic problems translated into direct personal hardship. Salaries were paid irregularly or not at all. Working conditions deteriorated as maintenance budgets were cut. Job security evaporated as government departments were reorganized or eliminated without warning. The psychological impact of working in this environment was profound. People who had built their identities around stable employment and predictable career progression found themselves in a world where nothing could be taken for granted. The future, which had once seemed manageable and plannable, became a source of constant anxiety. Amenhotep's response to this uncertainty was to retreat further into routine and ritual, clinging to the familiar patterns that had once provided structure and meaning to his life. He became obsessive about minor details of his work, spending excessive time on formatting and presentation, even when the content of what he was copying had become politically irrelevant. This obsession with form over substance was a common response among bureaucrats whose institutional framework was collapsing. When the larger purposes of their work became unclear or meaningless, they focused on the technical aspects that they could still control. It was a way of maintaining professional identity and personal dignity in circumstances that threatened both. But this coping strategy had its own costs. The excessive attention to detail slowed his work even further, making him less productive and more likely to miss deadlines. His supervisors, already concerned about his reliability, became increasingly impatient with his perfectionist tendencies. The irony was that his perfectionism, which had once been a professional asset, was now being interpreted as a sign of declining competence. In a fast-changing environment where adaptability and speed were valued over traditional accuracy, his careful, methodical approach seemed outdated and inefficient. The final crisis came during the copying of a crucial administrative document that needed to be completed quickly for transmission to other government offices. Amenhotep, true to his perfectionist nature, spent so much time ensuring that every detail was correct that he missed the deadline entirely. The document had to be reassigned to another scribe, completed hastily, and sent out with errors that would have horrified the old Amenhotep. This incident became the justification his supervisors needed to remove him from important assignments. He was reassigned to routine copying work that required less skill and carried less responsibility. His salary was reduced accordingly, and his prospects for advancement disappeared entirely. The demotion was presented as a temporary measure, a chance for him to recover his confidence and demonstrate his continuing value to the organization. But everyone involved understood that it was actually a face-saving way of beginning his transition out of the workforce. In a system where reputation and performance were everything, being reassigned to lesser work was usually the first step toward being dismissed entirely. Amenhotep accepted the demotion with the resignation of someone who no longer had the energy to fight for a career that had already been effectively ended. He continued to show up for work, performing the simple copying tasks assigned to him with mechanical precision, but the spark that had once driven his professional excellence was gone. His new assignments involved copying routine administrative forms and basic correspondence, work that could have been done by a scribe with a fraction of his training and experience. It was make work, designed to keep him busy while his superiors figured out how to remove him from the payroll without creating legal or social complications. The psychological impact of this professional limbo was perhaps worse than outright dismissal would have been. He was forced to continue performing the motions of his former career, while being constantly reminded that his expertise was no longer valued or needed. It was a form of slow-motion professional execution that left him alive but stripped of purpose and dignity. His daily routine became an exercise in meaningless repetition. He would wake up, eat his inadequate breakfast, walk to a workplace where he was no longer truly welcome, spend 8 hours copying documents that no one would ever read, and return home to an empty house where his deceased goose served as a reminder of better times. The physical symptoms of chronic stress began to manifest more severely. His hands, already damaged by decades of repetitive motion, developed arthritis that made writing painful and difficult. His eyesight continued to deteriorate, requiring him to work more slowly and carefully to avoid errors. His digestive system, stressed by poor diet and constant anxiety, became unreliable and uncomfortable. But perhaps the most devastating symptom was the gradual erosion of his memory and cognitive function. Skills that had been automatic for decades became effortful and uncertain. Hieroglyphs that he had read fluently for years suddenly seemed foreign and confusing. Administrative procedures that he had memorized became sources of confusion and anxiety. This cognitive decline was particularly tragic because it represented the loss of exactly the kind of institutional knowledge that Egypt desperately needed to preserve. Amenhotep's memory contained thousands of details about proper document formatting, administrative procedures, and technical skills that had been refined over generations. When his memory failed, that knowledge disappeared forever. The irony was that while Amenhotep was being marginalized and forgotten, Egypt was beginning to realize the cost of its institutional vandalism. Akhenaten's religious revolution was creating administrative chaos throughout the empire. Documents were being copied incorrectly because scribes didn't understand the new procedures. Administrative decisions were being delayed because officials couldn't figure out which forms to use. Military and diplomatic communications were becoming garbled because the standardized formulae that had ensured clarity were being abandoned. But by the time the problems became obvious, much of the institutional knowledge needed to fix them had already been lost. Experienced scribes like Amenhotep had been dismissed, demoted, or driven away. The training systems that had produced skilled bureaucrats had been dismantled. The accumulated wisdom of centuries of administrative practice had been scattered to the winds. Egypt would eventually recover from Akhenaten's revolution, but the recovery would take generations and would never fully restore what had been lost. The empire that emerged from the chaos would be smaller, weaker, and more vulnerable than the one that had been destroyed. The institutional knowledge that had made Egyptian administration the envy of the ancient world was gone forever. Amenhotep didn't live to see either the full extent of the collapse or the beginning of the recovery. His health, already compromised by stress and poor working conditions, continued to deteriorate. The combination of physical ailments, psychological distress, and social isolation created a downward spiral that accelerated as the months passed. He began to miss work more frequently, claiming illness that was sometimes genuine and sometimes a desperate attempt to avoid the daily humiliation of his reduced circumstances. Each absence was noted by his supervisors and used as further evidence of his declining usefulness to the organization. The end, when it came, was neither dramatic nor particularly noteworthy. Amenhotep simply failed to show up for work one morning, and when a colleague was sent to check on him, he was found dead in his bed, apparently from what we might now call a combination of stress-related illnesses and simple exhaustion. His death was recorded in the administrative records, with the same bureaucratic precision that had characterized his life. Amenhotep, scribe of the sacred recordings, deceased in his house, no apparent violence, personal effects to be inventoried and distributed according to law. The entry was written by another scribe, probably using one of the standardized formulae that Amenhotep had helped to develop and refine during his career. The irony was that his death was recorded more carefully and accurately than his life had been valued in its final years. The bureaucratic system that had discarded him as useless still required proper documentation of his demise, because even in collapse, Egyptian administration maintained its obsessive attention to record-keeping. His house was sold to pay the minimal debts he had accumulated during his final months. His tools, the reed pens, ink cakes, papyrus sheets, and wooden pallet that had been the instruments of his profession, were redistributed to other scribes, who probably never knew their previous owner's name. His few personal possessions were scattered among neighbors and distant relatives, who had little interest in preserving the memory of a man whose life had ended in failure and obscurity. There was no funeral monument, no inscription recording his achievements, no artistic representation of his life and work. In a civilization that was obsessed with preserving the memory of important people for eternity, Amenhotep disappeared from history as completely as if he had never existed. The only traces of his existence were the thousands of documents he had copied during his career, and even those would eventually decay or be lost as the administrative system that had created them continued to deteriorate. But perhaps that's the most appropriate memorial for a man whose life was dedicated to preserving the words and ideas of others rather than creating his own. Egyptian scribes were the invisible foundation of their civilization, the anonymous workers whose skill and dedication made possible all the grand achievements that we remember today. They built the pyramids with papyrus and ink rather than stone and mortar, creating the administrative systems that organized the labor and resources needed for Egypt's monumental construction projects. When we marvel at the precision of Egyptian engineering, we're seeing the result of calculations performed by scribes like Amenhotep. When we admire the sophistication of Egyptian art and literature, we're looking at works that were preserved and transmitted by generations of anonymous copyists. When we study Egyptian history, we're reading documents that were created by people whose names we'll never know, and whose personal stories have been lost forever. Amenhotep's life was both typical and tragic typical, because it represented the experience of thousands of skilled professionals, whose work was essential to their civilization, but whose individual contributions were rarely recognized, and tragic because it demonstrated how quickly institutional knowledge can be lost when political leaders prioritize ideology over practical wisdom. His story is a reminder that civilizations are more fragile than they appear. that the administrative systems we take for granted are actually complex, delicate structures that require constant maintenance and careful stewardship to survive. When those systems are deliberately destroyed or carelessly neglected, the consequences can be catastrophic not just for the institutions involved, but for the individuals whose lives depend on them. In the end, Amenhotep's most lasting achievement may have been his simple persistence in trying to do good work under impossible circumstances. Even as his world collapsed around him, even as his skills became obsolete and his experience was devalued, he continued to show up and do his job as well as he could. That kind of quiet dignity in the face of systemic failure is perhaps the most human response to inhuman circumstances. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the real tragedy isn't that Amenhotep died forgotten and unrecognized, but that we've forgotten how to value the kind of patient, careful, unglamorous work that makes civilization possible. In our rush to celebrate the dramatic and the innovative, we often overlook the importance of the routine and the traditional. Amenhotep spent his life copying other people's words, preserving other people's ideas, maintaining other people's systems. It wasn't glamorous work, and it didn't make him famous or wealthy or particularly important in the grand scheme of Egyptian politics. But it was necessary work, and he did it well for as long as he was able. That should be enough to remember him by, even if no one else remembers him at all. In a world that has largely forgotten the value of rare institutional memory and careful craftsmanship, Amenhotep's dedication to accuracy and precision seems almost quaint. But those qualities built an empire that lasted for thousands of years, and their absence contributed to its eventual collapse. But Amenhotep's death wasn't just the end of one man's career. It was a single thread, unraveling from a tapestry that had taken millennia to weave. And like most historical disasters, the real horror wasn't in the dramatic moments, but in the slow accumulation of small failures, each one seemingly insignificant until the whole structure collapsed under the weight of its own dysfunction. Let's step back for a moment and consider what Egypt looked like before Akhenaten decided to reinvent theology. The scribal system that employed Amenhotep wasn't just a government bureaucracy. It was the nervous system of an empire that stretched from Nubia to the Levant, a complex organism that had evolved over thousands of years to manage resources, coordinate activities, and preserve knowledge across vast distances and diverse populations. Picture the scale of what we're talking about here. Egypt wasn't just the Nile Valley. It was a sprawling imperial network that included trading posts in Africa, military garrisons in Asia, mining operations in the desert, and administrative centers scattered across thousands of miles of territory. Every grain shipment, every military patrol, every diplomatic message, every tax payment had to be tracked, recorded, and coordinated through a bureaucratic system that made modern government agencies look like corner grocery stores. The scribes, who made this system work, weren't just copying religious texts. They were managing supply chains that would make Amazon executives weep with envy. Consider the logistics involved in building a single pyramid. Millions of stone blocks had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and precisely positioned over decades of construction. The workers had to be fed, housed, paid, and replaced as they aged or died. The tools and equipment had to be manufactured, maintained, and distributed. The entire operation had to be coordinated with agricultural cycles, flood patterns, and military campaigns. All of this required paperwork, mountains of paperwork, Himalayan ranges of paperwork. Every stone block was numbered, catalogued, and tracked from quarry to final position. Every worker's daily rations were calculated based on their job assignment, physical condition, and family size. Every tool was inventoried, distributed, and accounted for. The administrative records for a single pyramid project would have filled entire buildings with papyrus scrolls, creating an information system that was more complex than anything Europe would achieve for another 2,000 years. And this wasn't just happening at the pyramids, it was happening everywhere, all the time, throughout the empire. Scribes in remote military outposts were filing daily reports on enemy movements, weather conditions, and supply status. Scribes in trading centers were recording every transaction, every arrival and departure, every fluctuation in commodity prices. Scribes in agricultural districts were tracking rainfall, flood levels, crop yields, and livestock populations with the precision of modern weather services. The knowledge required to maintain this system was staggering. Scribes had to master not just reading and writing, but mathematics, astronomy, engineering, medicine, law, theology, history, and geography. They had to understand construction techniques, agricultural cycles, military strategy, diplomatic protocol, and commercial practices. They were walking encyclopedias of practical knowledge, human databases containing the accumulated wisdom of centuries of Egyptian civilization. Take mathematics alone. Egyptian scribes had developed sophisticated calculation methods for geometry, algebra, and even basic calculus. They could calculate the volume of pyramids, the areas of irregular fields, the trajectories of projectiles, and the optimal angles for ramps and levers. Their mathematical papyri contained solutions to problems that wouldn't be solved again in Europe until the Renaissance. Their astronomical knowledge was equally impressive. They had calculated the length of the year to within minutes of the actual solar cycle. They could predict eclipses, track planetary movements, and navigate by the stars with accuracy that rivals modern instruments. The astronomical ceiling in the tomb of Senwet contains star maps that are still used by modern archaeologists to date ancient events. Their medical knowledge was perhaps most remarkable of all. Egyptian medical papyri describe surgical procedures, diagnostic techniques, and pharmaceutical preparations that demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and physiology. They performed cataract surgery, set broken bones, and treated infections with herbal medicines that modern science has confirmed to have genuine therapeutic properties. All of this knowledge was preserved and transmitted through the scribal education system that had trained people like Amenhotep. Students spent years memorizing not just hieroglyphic symbols, but mathematical formulae, astronomical data, medical procedures, legal precedents, and engineering specifications. They learned to write not just accurately, but beautifully, creating documents that were simultaneously functional records and works of art. The scribal schools were like medieval universities, centers of learning where the brightest minds of each generation were trained to carry forward the intellectual heritage of their civilization. Students came from all over the empire to study in Memphis, Thebes, and other major centers, creating networks of shared knowledge and professional relationships that spanned the known world. But this wasn't just about preserving old knowledge. It was about creating new knowledge through systematic observation and experimentation. Egyptian scribes were constantly recording, measuring, testing, and refining their understanding of the world around them. They maintained detailed records of Nile flood levels going back centuries, allowing them to predict and prepare for variations in the river's behavior. They tracked disease outbreaks, documenting symptoms, treatments, and outcomes in ways that allowed them to develop increasingly effective medical interventions. Their agricultural records were particularly sophisticated. They knew which crops grew best in which types of soil, how different irrigation techniques affected yields, which fertilizers were most effective, and how to rotate crops to maintain soil fertility. This knowledge allowed Egypt to maintain agricultural productivity that supported population densities that wouldn't be matched in other parts of the world for millennia. The administrative side of this knowledge system was equally complex. Scribes had to understand not just what information to record, but how to organize it, store it, and retrieve it when needed. They developed filing systems, cross-referencing methods, and search techniques that allowed them to locate specific documents among vast archives. The Great Library of Alexandria, which became famous throughout the ancient world, was built on organizational principles that had been developed by Egyptian scribes over thousands of years. They also understood the importance of redundancy, and backup systems. Important documents were copied multiple times and stored in different locations to protect against fire, flood, or war. Critical knowledge was memorized by multiple scribes to ensure that it wouldn't be lost if written records were destroyed. The entire system was designed with the understanding that knowledge is fragile and must be actively protected to survive. This brings us to the true tragedy of what happened during Akhenaten's reign. It wasn't just that one pharaoh made some bad decisions. It was that an entire civilization's accumulated knowledge was deliberately thrown away in the name of religious purity. Imagine if every university in the world suddenly decided to burn their libraries and start over from scratch. That's essentially what happened to Egypt during the Amenhotep period. The scribes who were dismissed or reassigned weren't just losing their jobs, they were taking with them irreplaceable knowledge that had taken generations to accumulate. When the master astronomers were expelled from their temples, the star charts they had maintained for centuries were abandoned and eventually lost. When the medical scribes were reassigned to copying hymns to Aten, their patient records and treatment protocols were forgotten. When the engineering scribes were sent to work on Akhenaten's new capital, the maintenance records for Egypt's irrigation systems were neglected. The immediate effects were probably not dramatic enough to alarm anyone in authority. Irrigation systems don't collapse overnight. They deteriorate slowly over years as routine maintenance is deferred and minor problems go unrepaired. Medical knowledge doesn't disappear instantly. It fades gradually as experienced practitioners retire without properly training their replacements. Administrative systems don't break down immediately. They become less efficient over time as institutional memory is lost and procedures are simplified or abandoned. But the cumulative effect was catastrophic. Egypt's technological edge, built up over millennia of careful observation and systematic improvement, began to erode. The agricultural productivity that had made the empire wealthy started to decline as sophisticated farming techniques were forgotten. The military effectiveness that had kept Egypt's enemies at bay diminished as logistical systems broke down and strategic knowledge was lost. Even more seriously, Egypt lost its ability to adapt and respond to new challenges. The old system hadn't just preserved existing knowledge, it had generated new knowledge through continuous observation and experimentation. When that system was dismantled, Egypt became intellectually static, unable to innovate or evolve in response to changing circumstances. The psychological impact on individual scribes like Amenhotep was just one aspect of a much larger cultural trauma. Imagine being part of a civilization that had existed for thousands of years, that had built monuments that would last for eternity, that had accumulated knowledge that seemed complete and perfect, and then watching it all be declared worthless and abandoned. The sense of loss and disorientation must have been overwhelming. But perhaps even more devastating was the loss of purpose and meaning that came with the destruction of the institutional framework that had given structure to people's lives. Egyptian society wasn't just organized around economic relationships, it was organized around cosmic relationships, with each person playing a specific role in maintaining the harmony between earthly and divine realms. When that cosmological framework was suddenly changed, people lost not just their jobs, but their understanding of their place in the universe. The scribes were particularly affected because their work had been explicitly connected to the gods. They weren't just government employees, they were servants of Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. Their accuracy in copying text wasn't just a matter of professional competence, it was a religious duty that connected them to divine truth. When the old gods were abandoned and new ones installed, the spiritual foundation of their work was undermined. This spiritual crisis was compounded by practical problems that made their work increasingly difficult and frustrating. The disruption of trade relationships meant that papyrus became more expensive and lower quality. The reassignment of skilled craftsmen meant that reed pens were harder to obtain and poorly made. The diversion of resources to Akhenaten's building projects meant that working conditions deteriorated and salaries were paid irregularly. combination of spiritual, psychological, and practical stresses created a perfect storm of professional dysfunction. Scribes who had once taken pride in their work began to view it as meaningless drudgery. The quality of their output declined as their motivation evaporated. The institutional knowledge that they had preserved so carefully began to decay through neglect and indifference. But the real tragedy wasn't just what was lost, it was how unnecessary the loss was. Akhenaten's religious reforms weren't forced on Egypt by external enemies or natural disasters. They were choices made by political leaders who valued ideological purity over practical wisdom. The knowledge that was destroyed could have been preserved and adapted to serve new purposes. The institutional systems that were dismantled could have been reformed rather than replaced. The irony is that Akhenaten himself was probably not anti-intellectual. His religious innovations showed considerable theological sophistication, and his new capital at Amarna displayed remarkable artistic creativity. He wasn't opposed to knowledge and culture. He was opposed to knowledge and culture that didn't serve his particular vision of religious truth. This is a pattern that recurs throughout history whenever ideological movements gain political power. The problem isn't usually that the ideologues are stupid or anti-intellectual. It's that they're so convinced of the correctness of their ideas that they can't tolerate the existence of alternative approaches. They see institutional knowledge not as valuable in its own right, but as either supportive of their ideology or threatening to it. In Akhenaten's case, the existing scribal system was threatening because it was connected to the old religious framework that he was trying to replace. The knowledge that scribes possessed wasn't just technical, it was theological. Their understanding of mathematics was connected to their understanding of cosmic harmony. Their medical knowledge was connected to their understanding of divine healing. Their administrative skills were connected to their understanding of pharaonic authority. From Akhenaten's perspective, you couldn't preserve the technical knowledge while abandoning the religious framework, because the two were too closely intertwined. To truly establish his new religion, he had to destroy the institutional structures that supported the old religion, even if those structures also supported practical knowledge that was essential to the functioning of Egyptian civilization. This is why ideological revolutions are often so destructive to human knowledge and welfare. It's not enough for the revolutionaries to establish their new ideas. They also have to destroy the old ideas completely, and that often means destroying the institutions and people who embodied those ideas. The result is usually a massive loss of accumulated wisdom that takes generations to rebuild, if it's ever rebuilt at all. In Egypt's case, the damage was eventually repaired to some extent. Akhenaten's successors, including the famous Tutankhamun, restored the old religious system and tried to rebuild the institutional structures that had been destroyed. But much of the knowledge that was lost during the Amarna period was never recovered. The continuity that had been Egypt's greatest strength was permanently broken. The scribal system that was eventually rebuilt was simpler and less sophisticated than the one that had existed before Akhenaten. Many of the technical specializations were lost and never restored. The astronomical observations that had been maintained for centuries were interrupted, creating gaps in the data that affected the accuracy of calendar calculations for years afterward. The medical knowledge that had been accumulated over millennia was partially lost, reducing the effectiveness of Egyptian healthcare. Most seriously, Egypt lost its intellectual confidence. The civilization that had once been eager to experiment and innovate became conservative and backward-looking. Instead of building on their existing knowledge to create new understanding, Egyptian thinkers became focused on preserving what little remained of their ancient wisdom. The dynamism that had made Egypt the most advanced civilization in the ancient world was replaced by a static traditionalism that left it vulnerable to more innovative competitors. This intellectual stagnation had practical consequences that extended far beyond the scribal profession. Egypt's military effectiveness declined as strategic and tactical knowledge was lost. Its economic competitiveness was reduced as commercial and manufacturing techniques were forgotten. Its diplomatic influence waned as the cultural achievements that had impressed foreign rulers were no longer being created. The ultimate irony is that Akhenaten's attempt to strengthen Egypt by purifying its religion actually weakened it by destroying the knowledge base that had made its strength possible. By the time his successors realized what had been lost, much of the damage was irreversible. Egypt remained a major power for several more centuries, but it never again achieved the technological and cultural dominance that had characterized the Old and Middle Kingdom periods. This pattern of ideological movements destroying the very foundations of the civilizations they claim to be improving is disturbingly common throughout human history. The Chinese Cultural Revolution destroyed centuries of accumulated learning in the name of revolutionary purity. The Khmer Rouge's anti-intellectual campaign eliminated an entire generation of educated Cambodians. Even democratic societies have experienced periods when political movements targeted academic institutions and scientific research for ideological reasons. The lesson from Amenhotep's story isn't just about ancient Egypt, it's about the fragility of human knowledge and the importance of protecting institutional memory from political interference. The scribes who maintained Egyptian civilization weren't just government employees. They were guardians of humanity's intellectual heritage. When they were dismissed or demoralized, that heritage was put at risk. Modern societies face similar challenges, though they're usually less dramatic than Akhenaten's religious revolution. Budget cuts to libraries, schools, and research institutions have the same effect as political purges. They disrupt the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. The retirement of experienced professionals without adequate training of their replacements creates gaps in institutional memory that can have serious long-term consequences. The digital age has created new vulnerabilities as well as new opportunities. While we can now store vast amounts of information in electronic form, we've also become dependent on technological systems that are vulnerable to disruption. If our digital infrastructure were to fail, much of our accumulated knowledge could become inaccessible, just as Egyptian knowledge became inaccessible when the scribal system that preserved it was destroyed. Perhaps most importantly, we've become so focused on innovation and change that we sometimes forget the value of preservation and continuity. In our rush to embrace new ideas and technologies, we risk losing sight of older knowledge that might still be valuable. The wisdom that Amenhotep spent his life preserving wasn't just historical curiosity, it was practical knowledge that had been tested and refined over generations of use. But before we let our ancient scribe rest in peace, let's spend a few more moments in the world he inhabited, because the details of daily life in ancient Egypt reveal truths about human nature that transcend time and place. The morning routine that began Amenhotep's day, the careful washing with precious water, the consumption of bread that wore down his teeth grain by grain, the gathering of tools that represented his entire professional identity. These small rituals connected him to a cosmic order that modern people can barely comprehend. Egyptian civilization wasn't just about building monuments and worshipping gods. It was about creating a society where every action, no matter how mundane, was embedded in a web of meaning that connected the individual to the eternal. When Amenhotep mixed his ink each morning, he wasn't just preparing writing materials, he was participating in an act of creation that echoed the god's daily renewal of the world. The black ink represented the fertile silt of the Nile. The red ink symbolized the life-giving blood of divine beings. And the act of writing itself was considered a form of magic that could make thoughts permanent and give words power over reality. This magical understanding of writing wasn't just religious symbolism, it had practical implications that shaped every aspect of a scribe's work. Errors weren't just mistakes that needed correction, they were potential tears in the fabric of reality that could allow chaos to enter the ordered world. This is why Egyptian scribes were so obsessively careful about accuracy, why they would sometimes spend hours perfecting a single line of text. why they developed such elaborate systems of checking and double-checking their work. The hieroglyphic writing system itself embodied this magical worldview. Each symbol wasn't just a representation of a sound or concept, it was believed to contain the actual essence of what it depicted. Writing the hieroglyph for bird didn't just refer to birds in general, it summoned the spiritual power of birdness itself. This is why some hieroglyphs in tomb inscriptions were deliberately broken or incomplete, to prevent them from becoming too powerful and potentially dangerous to the deceased. For scribes like Amenhotep, this meant that their work carried enormous spiritual responsibility. They weren't just recording information, they were shaping reality through the act of writing. A carelessly written medical prescription could literally affect the patient's health through magical as well as medical pathways. An incorrectly copied religious text could disrupt the cosmic order and bring divine punishment not just on the scribe, but on his entire community. This spiritual dimension of scribal work created a level of job-related stress that modern people can barely imagine. Every day, Amenhotep carried the weight of cosmic responsibility on his shoulders. Every pen stroke was a potential act of creation or destruction. Every decision about formatting or word choice could have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate practical purpose of the document. The tools that Amenhotep used for his work were themselves objects of deep spiritual significance. Reed pens weren't just writing instruments, they were sacred implements that had to be prepared and maintained according to religious protocols. The reeds were harvested from specific locations along the Nile at particular times of year, cut to precise lengths using blessed knives, and shaped using techniques that had been passed down through generations of scribes. The papyrus that provided his writing surface was even more spiritually charged. Made from plants that grew in the sacred waters of the Nile, papyrus was considered to be imbued with the life-giving power of the river itself. The process of making papyrus involved complex rituals designed to preserve and enhance its spiritual properties. Scribes who worked with papyrus had to maintain states of ritual purity, avoiding certain foods and activities that might contaminate their spiritual essence and reduce the effectiveness of their writing. Even the workspace where Amenhotep performed his duties was organized according to cosmic principles. His desk faced east, to align with the daily rebirth of the sun god Ra. His tools were arranged in specific patterns that mirrored the arrangement of stars in the sky. His reference materials were stored in a precise hierarchy that reflected the relative importance of different types of knowledge in the divine order. This integration of spiritual and practical concerns extended to every aspect of Egyptian society, creating a civilization where religious belief and daily life were inseparably intertwined. The farmer who planted crops was participating in the annual cycle of death and rebirth that ensured cosmic continuity. The soldier who marched to war was reenacting the eternal struggle between order and chaos. The merchant who traded goods was facilitating the flow of divine abundance throughout the world. For Amenhotep and his fellow scribes, this meant that their seemingly mundane work of copying documents and keeping records was actually a form of religious service that helped maintain the stability of the universe. They weren't just bureaucrats, they were priests of the written word, guardians of divine knowledge, custodians of cosmic truth. This understanding helps explain why the disruption of the scribal system during Akhenaten's reign was so psychologically devastating. It wasn't just that people lost their jobs or that administrative systems became less efficient. It was that an entire worldview was called into question. If the old gods were false and the old ways were wrong, then what did that say about the cosmic order that had given meaning to people's lives for thousands of years? The existential crisis that Amenhotep experienced wasn't just personal, it was civilizational. An entire culture was being forced to question its most fundamental assumptions about reality, meaning, and purpose. The careful rituals that had structured daily life for generations were suddenly declared meaningless or dangerous. The knowledge that had been lovingly preserved and transmitted for centuries was dismissed as superstition or heresy. This kind of wholesale cultural transformation is always traumatic, but it was particularly devastating in ancient Egypt because Egyptian civilization was built on the assumption of eternal continuity. Unlike other ancient cultures that expected periodic upheavals and renewals, Egyptians believed that their way of life was permanently established by divine decree and would continue unchanged forever. The pharaoh wasn't just a political ruler, he was the living embodiment of cosmic order, the human representative of divine authority on earth. When Akhenaten declared that the traditional gods were false and that only Aten deserved worship, he wasn't just changing religious policy, he was overturning the fundamental basis of Egyptian civilization. For scribes, this created an impossible situation. Their training had taught them that accuracy and tradition were sacred values, that change was dangerous, that their role was to preserve eternal truths rather than create new ones. Suddenly they were being asked to abandon everything they had learned and embrace a completely different understanding of reality. The psychological stress of this transition helps explain why so many experienced scribes like Amenhotep suffered from what we might now recognize as symptoms of severe anxiety and depression. They were experiencing not just career difficulties, but a complete collapse of their worldview. Everything they had believed about the nature of reality, the purpose of their work, and their place in the cosmic order was being challenged or rejected. Modern people who have lived through major social transformations, wars, revolutions, economic collapses, technological disruptions can perhaps understand something of what these ancient scribes experienced. But even the most dramatic modern changes rarely involve the complete rejection of a civilization's fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality itself. The recovery from this kind of cultural trauma takes generations, if it happens at all. Even after Akhenaten's successors restored the traditional religious system, Egyptian civilization never fully regained its earlier confidence and dynamism. The assumption of eternal continuity had been broken, and with it the psychological foundation that had made Egyptian achievements possible. This helps explain why post-Amarna Egypt, despite its continued political and military power, never again reached the cultural and intellectual heights of the Old and Middle Kingdom periods. The creative energy that had built the pyramids and developed hieroglyphic writing and created the world's first complex bureaucratic state had been dissipated by the trauma of Akhenaten's revolution. The scribes who came after Amenhotep's generation were competent professionals, but they lacked the cosmic confidence that had characterized their predecessors. They preserved and transmitted knowledge, but they rarely added to it. They maintained administrative systems, but they didn't improve them. They copied texts accurately, but they didn't create new forms of literary expression. This intellectual stagnation wasn't due to lack of ability. It was due to a fundamental shift in cultural attitudes toward change and innovation. Before Akhenaten, Egyptians had been confident that change could be good, that new knowledge could enhance their understanding of divine truth, that human creativity could contribute to cosmic perfection. After Akhenaten, change came to be seen as dangerous, innovation as potentially heretical, creativity as a threat to hard-won stability. The tragedy is that this conservative turn, while understandable as a response to trauma, ultimately made Egyptian civilization more vulnerable rather than less. By becoming resistant to change, Egypt lost its ability to adapt to new challenges and opportunities. When new powers arose in the Mediterranean world, first the Greeks, then the Romans, Egypt found itself unable to compete effectively because it had lost the intellectual flexibility that had once been its greatest strength. But perhaps there's another way to understand Amenhotep's story, one that focuses not on what was lost, but on what endured. Despite all the upheavals of the Amarna period, despite the collapse of institutional systems and the trauma of cultural transformation, some essential aspects of Egyptian civilization did survive. The hieroglyphic writing system continued to be used for another 1,000 years. The administrative techniques developed by generations of scribes were adapted and refined by later rulers. The architectural and artistic traditions that had been briefly disrupted were restored and continue to evolve. Most importantly, the basic human values that Amenhotep embodied: dedication to accuracy, respect for knowledge, commitment to public service, willingness to work hard for modest rewards. These values survived the political and religious upheavals that destroyed so much else. They survived because they were embedded not just in institutions, but in individual character, not just in official policies, but in personal habits and cultural practices. This suggests that while institutions and belief systems are indeed fragile, human values and practical knowledge have a resilience that can survive even catastrophic disruptions. The scribes who came after Akhenaten may have worked in a different religious context and under different political conditions, but they still understood the importance of accurate record-keeping, careful document preparation, and systematic knowledge preservation. In this sense, Amenhotep's legacy lived on, not in any specific documents he created, or any particular innovations he developed, but in the example he set of how to maintain professional integrity under difficult circumstances. His willingness to continue doing his best work, even when his world was collapsing around him, became part of the cultural DNA that allowed Egyptian civilization to eventually recover and continue. This kind of cultural transmission happens below the level of conscious awareness, through the daily example of ordinary people who embody important values in their routine behavior. Children learn not just from formal education, but from watching how adults around them approach their work, handle their responsibilities, and respond to challenges. Amenhotep may never have taught in a formal scribal school, but his approach to his work, careful, methodical, conscientious, persistent, was observed and absorbed by younger scribes who worked alongside him. When they faced their own professional challenges, they drew on the example he had set, even if they couldn't consciously articulate what they had learned from him. This is how human societies really preserve and transmit their most important knowledge, not just through written records and formal institutions, but through the lived example of individuals who embody cultural values in their daily practice. Amenhotep's quiet dedication to doing his job well may have had more lasting impact than the specific documents he copied or the administrative procedures he followed. And that brings us back to the larger lesson of his story, which is about the importance of ordinary people who maintain civilization's basic functions even when the headlines are dominated by dramatic political and social upheavals, while pharaohs rose and fell, while religious systems were overthrown and restored, while armies marched and battles were fought. Scribes like Amenhotep kept the essential work of society moving forward. This work isn't glamorous or exciting, but it's absolutely necessary. Someone has to keep track of food supplies, maintain communication networks, preserve important knowledge, and ensure that complex systems continue to function. When this work is disrupted or devalued, the consequences can be catastrophic, as Egypt learned during the Amarna period. Modern societies face similar challenges as we navigate technological disruption, political polarization, and rapid social change. The institutions and systems we depend on, schools, libraries, government agencies, infrastructure networks, are maintained by millions of people whose work rarely makes headlines, but whose contributions are essential to our collective well-being. These modern scribes, teachers, librarians, clerks, technicians, maintenance workers, civil servants deserve the same respect and support that we give to more visible professions. Their work may seem routine and unglamorous, but it's the foundation that makes everything else possible. And so we return to where we began, with Amenhotep waking up in his modest house in Thebes, preparing for another day of copying documents in the service of gods and pharaohs who barely knew he existed. The routine was boring, the work was repetitive, the recognition was minimal, and the future was uncertain. But for a brief moment in the long sweep of human history, one man got up every morning and tried to do his job well. His story reminds us that civilization is always just one generation away from collapse, but it also reminds us that it's sustained by the daily efforts of ordinary people who choose to do their jobs well, even when the circumstances are difficult and the recognition is minimal. In honouring his memory, we honour all those who keep the world running through their quiet competence and steadfast dedication. Amenhotep may be forgotten by history, but his contributions echo through time in every document that preserves human knowledge, every system that functions smoothly, every tradition that connects us to our past and guides us toward our future. He showed up, he did his best, and he kept the machinery of civilization running for one more day. And really, when you think about it, that's not such a bad way to have spent a life. Even if nobody remembers your name, even if your work seems insignificant, even if the world changes so fast that your skills become obsolete, the quiet dedication to doing good work under impossible circumstances is perhaps the most human response to inhuman circumstances. That's more than most of us will ever accomplish, and it's certainly more than most of us will ever be remembered for. Amenhotep, scribe of the sacred recordings, died as he lived, quietly, competently, and without any expectation that history would notice. But we've noticed now, haven't we? And maybe that's the closest thing to immortality that any of us can reasonably hope for that somewhere. Somehow, someone will tell our story and remember that we were here. We tried our best, and we mattered, even if only for a moment. Sleep well, Amenhotep. Sleep well. All you guardians of human civilization, past and present and future. Your shift is over, but your legacy endures in every library, every archive, every carefully maintained record that preserves the accumulated wisdom of our species. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for doing your best. And thank you for reminding us that the most important work is often the work that nobody notices until it's gone.